December 7, 1941. The date that lives in infamy. Japanese carrier planes catch the American Pacific Fleet sleeping at Pearl Harbor, turning battleships into coffins and proving that the aircraft carrier is the new king of naval warfare. For the next 2 years, that wound festered in the minds of every American sailor. The Japanese had written the textbook on carrier strikes. What they didn't know was that the Americans were studying it, perfecting it, and preparing to return it with devastating interest. Fast forward to February 17, 1944. The target is Truk Lagoon, a fortress the Japanese called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Protected by 140 miles of coral reef, bristling with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, and home to 5 airfields, Truk was the operational heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese High Command considered it untouchable. They were catastrophically wrong. At dawn that morning, the horizon didn't fill with the rising sun flag of Japanese Zeros. Instead, it exploded with the roar of American Hellcats and Avengers. Task Force 58 had arrived, and they weren't just settling a score. They were demonstrating that they had perfected the very weapon used against them. This was Operation Hailstone, the revenge strike that turned the hunter into the hunted and transformed Japan's impregnable fortress into the largest shipwreck cemetery in the Pacific. To understand the brilliance of Operation Hailstone, you need to understand what made Truk so strategically vital. Located in the Caroline Islands, Truk Lagoon was nature's perfect naval base. Picture a massive harbor nearly 40 miles across, encircled by protective coral reefs that served as natural breakwaters. Inside this lagoon sat dozens of islands, each converted into military installations. 5 major airfields, torpedo workshops, communication centers, fuel depots capable of supplying an entire fleet for months. This wasn't just a base. This was the forward headquarters of the combined fleet, the crown jewel of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. From Truk, Japan could threaten Australia, control the Solomons, and dominate the Central Pacific. It was the linchpin holding their defensive perimeter together. And by early 1944, that perimeter was cracking under American pressure. The American naval situation had transformed dramatically since Pearl Harbor. No longer the desperate, defensive force scrambling to protect Hawaii. The United States Navy had become an industrial monster. Shipyards were launching carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The result was Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell. 9 aircraft carriers, 6 fast battleships, 10 cruisers, over 500 aircraft. It was the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled in human history, and it was about to prove its worth. Spruance faced a strategic dilemma. The Americans were planning to invade Eniwetok Atoll, but Truk sat on their flank like a loaded gun. Leave it operational, and Japanese aircraft and warships could strike the invasion force from behind. But attacking Truk seemed like suicide. Intelligence suggested hundreds of Japanese aircraft were based there. The memory of Tarawa, where Japanese defenses had shredded Marine landing forces, haunted American planning. Could carriers get close enough to strike without being overwhelmed by land-based Japanese air power? The Japanese, meanwhile, were drowning in overconfidence. Admiral Minaichi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, believed the Americans were still months away from any offensive action against Truk. The lagoon had never been seriously threatened. Why would it be now? But then, on February 4th, everything changed. A single American reconnaissance aircraft, a high-altitude PB-4Y Liberator, was spotted over the lagoon. It was just one plane, but Koga panicked. He ordered an immediate evacuation of major warships. The super battleship Musashi, one of the largest warships ever built, fled toward Palau along with heavy cruisers and fleet carriers. In his haste, Koga made a fatal error. He saved his showpieces but left behind the logistical backbone of the base. Dozens of merchant ships, tankers, ammunition carriers, and support vessels remained trapped inside the reef. They were sitting ducks, and the Americans were 13 days away with a storm in their hands. How do you achieve complete surprise against the most heavily defended base in the Pacific? This is where American tactical evolution becomes surgical. At Pearl Harbor, The Japanese had used a single massive wave of mixed aircraft. It was effective but blunt. The Americans at Truk refined the concept into something far more lethal. At 6:40 a.m. on February 17th, the first wave launched from the American carriers. But these aircraft carried no bombs. 70 Grumman F-6F Hellcats, pure fighters. Their only mission was air supremacy. The Japanese mistake at Pearl Harbor had been allowing American planes to take off during the attack, creating confusion and danger. Spruance ensured that wouldn't happen at Truk. The Hellcats descended on Japanese airfields like avenging angels. Within the first hour, they shot down over 30 aircraft attempting to get airborne and destroyed another 40 on the ground before their pilots could even reach the cockpits. But how did 70 American fighters reach Truk undetected? The Japanese had radar. The answer reveals the growing technological gap between the two navies. Japanese radar in 1944 was primitive, easily cluttered by weather. The Americans exploited this ruthlessly. Task Force 58 approached through a storm front, using the weather as a mask. On Japanese radar screens, the massive American strike appeared as nothing more than atmospheric interference. By the time radar operators realized the clutter was actually hundreds of warplanes, Hellcats were already screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. Task Force 58 had maintained absolute radio silence for days. Not a single transmission. Navigation was conducted through light signals and pre-briefed flight paths. According to Japanese after-action reports, many soldiers first became aware of the attack when Browning machine gun rounds started tearing through their barracks roofs. There was no warning, no air raid sirens, just sudden, overwhelming violence. In carrier warfare, the first 15 minutes determined the next 48 hours. By dedicating the entire first wave to clearing the skies, Spruance transformed Truk from an impregnable fortress into a defenseless shooting gallery. The Japanese land-based air power, their greatest defensive asset, was neutralized before the first American bomb even fell on a ship. This was the lesson of Pearl Harbor perfected. Control the air, and you control everything beneath it. If the first wave was about surprise, the second wave was about annihilation. This is where Operation Hailstone becomes the true reverse of Pearl Harbor. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo made what historians consider one of the great tactical errors of the war. After 2 successful strike waves, he canceled the third wave. He feared American land-based bombers and didn't want to risk his carriers. That decision left Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks and repair facilities intact, allowing the U.S. Navy to recover far faster than Japan anticipated. Spruance and Mitchell learned from that mistake. They didn't want to damage Truk. They wanted to erase it. Operation Hailstone lasted 2 full days and 1 entire night. This sustained assault represents a critical evolution in carrier warfare doctrine. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was liquidation. The second day of strikes focused on infrastructure. American dive bombers systematically destroyed fuel storage tanks, workshops, dry docks, and communication facilities. Every building that could repair a ship or refuel an aircraft became a priority target. The Japanese defenders, already reeling from the fighter sweep, could only watch as their base infrastructure was methodically dismantled. But the most revolutionary moment came on the night of February 17. The Americans did something the Japanese considered impossible. They launched a night carrier strike. USS Enterprise, using specially equipped TBF Avenger torpedo bombers with radar sets, conducted nocturnal bombing runs. These pilots flew in complete darkness, guided only by the glowing radar screens in their cockpits. They didn't drop bombs blindly. Using radar, they identified and targeted specific Japanese tankers and cargo vessels. Imagine being a Japanese sailor trapped in that lagoon. You survived the daylight attacks. Night falls, and you think you're safe. Then ships start exploding in the darkness around you. No engine sounds, no warning, just sudden fire and death emerging from invisible attackers. The psychological impact was devastating. The Japanese had no night fighter capability. They couldn't even see the enemy killing them. While Koga had evacuated his heavy cruisers and battleships, the merchant fleet, known as the Maru ships, remained behind and were slaughtered. These weren't glamorous warships, but they were arguably more important. These vessels carried food, cement for bunkers, spare parts for aircraft, ammunition, and fuel. In 2 days, American aircraft sank over 250,000 tons of shipping. The numbers are staggering. 1,250 sorties flown, 25 American planes lost, over 250 Japanese aircraft destroyed, nearly 50 ships sunk. The kill ratio was 10-1. This wasn't a raid. It was industrial-scale demolition of a military installation. Now we must address the controversy. Some historians argue that because Admiral Koga evacuated his major warships, Operation Hailstone was ultimately a failure. The big prizes escaped. The Musashi sailed away. Did the Japanese win? This argument fundamentally misunderstands modern warfare and reveals why Spruance was a genius. A naval base exists to support a fleet. Without fuel, without repair facilities, without spare parts, a base is just islands and empty buildings. By destroying Truk's infrastructure, the Americans rendered it useless even for the ships that escaped. When Koga's fleet needed to refit and refuel, they couldn't return to Truk. They had to retreat all the way back to the Philippines, or the home islands of Japan. This extended their supply lines by thousands of miles and consumed precious fuel oil they couldn't replace. More importantly, the Americans implemented a strategy that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. After Operation Hailstone, they didn't invade Truk. Why sacrifice 20,000 Marines taking an island with no ships and no operational aircraft? Instead, they surrounded it. American submarines blockaded the lagoon. Occasional bomber raids reminded the Japanese garrison they were still being watched. And then the Americans simply moved on. 30,000 Japanese soldiers were left on Truk for the rest of the war. Cut off from supply, starving, they were forced to plant sweet potatoes and bomb craters just to survive. The Gibraltar of the Pacific became a ghost town, a prison where men slowly died of malnutrition while the war passed them by. The Americans called it island hopping or leapfrogging. Bypassed the strong points, cut them off, let them wither. It was brutally efficient, and saved countless American lives. True strategic victory isn't always measured in enemy soldiers killed. Sometimes it's measured in enemies removed from the equation entirely. A bypassed, isolated base is just as dead as a conquered one, and it costs far fewer lives to achieve. The long-term implications of Operation Hailstone reshaped naval warfare forever. First, it proved the death of the static fortress. In the age of carrier aviation, no fixed position is truly safe. Truk had the best natural defenses in the world. Coral reefs, multiple airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. None of it mattered. Land cannot move. A carrier task force is a floating airfield that can appear anywhere, strike from any direction, and vanish before effective retaliation. Hailstone demonstrated that mobile air power will always defeat stationary defenses, no matter how heavily fortified. Second, the Americans learned from the Japanese mistake at Pearl Harbor. You must destroy infrastructure, not just fighting ships. Sinking warships makes headlines, but destroying fuel tanks, workshops, and supply depots ends wars. By targeting Truk's logistical capabilities, the U.S. ensured the base could never be rebuilt or reoccupied during the conflict. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Operation Hailstone represented a psychological earthquake for Japan. The fall of Truk shattered the myth of the inner defense perimeter. If their strongest fortress could be neutralized in 48 hours, nowhere was safe. Not Saipan, not the Philippines, not even the home islands. Japanese military planners realized they were facing an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity, technological superiority, and the willingness to use both without mercy. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. Pearl Harbor was a tactical victory that started a war. Operation Hailstone was a tactical masterpiece that helped end one. Today, if you visit Truk Lagoon, you won't find a bustling naval base. You'll find one of the most surreal diving destinations on Earth. Hundreds of feet below the turquoise surface, the ghost fleet still rests. Tankers with bomb holes the size of houses. Hellcat wreckage scattered across the sand. The rusted remains of the ammunition ship Aiko Kumaru, still lying where she exploded. It's a silent underwater monument to the day the United States Navy returned the favor of December 7, 1941, with cold, calculated interest. The Gibraltar of the Pacific didn't fall to a bloody amphibious invasion. It fell to the precision of naval air power, and in falling, It proved that the Pacific was no longer a Japanese lake. The revenge was complete. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. All that remained was the terrible arithmetic of finishing it.